Hi, welcome to the November 4th meeting of the Kubernetes VMware User Group. On today's agenda, we've got currently one item, which is a recap of recent announcements and presentations that went on some of the recent conferences, which were VMworld, maybe the associated DevOps Loop event, and KubeCon. So I've got a little deck prepared on that. Miles Gray, who co-presented with me at KubeCon, is probably going to be joining, but I don't see him online yet. But with that said, let me share this deck that just is a way to organize my thoughts on what happened in the last month. Okay, so I assume people can see that, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the first thing that happened, this is at KubeCon. I guess technically KubeCon was after VMworld, but part of the KubeCon presentations, it was a hybrid conference that was partially online, partially recorded. So I'm going to show some slides that were presented at KubeCon regarding recent updates to the vSphere cloud provider. They were recorded in advance. So technically, you'll see a few slides here that indicate some of these things are roadmap or projected, but they have indeed already happened. So ignore the fact that they're called out as roadmap. And one of the devs, Nicole Hahn, gave this presentation at KubeCon, but there have been some recent updates. The latest version has some zone and labeling support, improved support for NSXT, and well, you can read it here. The cloud provider, if you're not using a distro that installs it as part of the distro installation, now has a mechanism to be installed via Helm chart. You know, this might be useful if you're using pure upstream open source Kubernetes or some distro that doesn't install the cloud provider for you. Oh, I didn't. Excuse me, let me shut this off. At this, it was recorded, so I accidentally triggered playback of the recording. So the other subject that came up at KubeCon was the vSphere cloud provider moving out of tree. This was covered in the SIG cloud provider maintainer track session. And it's just further warning of a deprecation notice that if you're still running Kubernetes clusters that were deployed so long ago that you happen to be using the in-tree cloud provider, you're kind of getting a final warning that your days are numbered and you have to make accommodations to migrate to the newer out of tree. Given that there have been no new features added to that in-tree, there's probably plenty of good reasons to move anyway, even if you're not forced to do it. Kind of the only situation I can see that's valid for clinging to life on that old legacy thing is that you're maybe on ancient hardware or an ancient vSphere release that you haven't upgraded that can't be supported by the new out of tree. But that KubeCon session is recorded. Yeah, go ahead.
When is it being removed?
You know, there was an interesting dance that occurred during the cloud provider SIG where the chair of the cloud provider SIG said in his presentation that, look, I'm wink, wink announcing that this is in about a year, because if I gave you the honest date, no one would move. And he kind of implied that even though he's telling you you've got about a year, that maybe when this year comes about, there will be a further extension granted. So
I feel like they had said before that it was 1.22 was the original plan, right?
Yeah, they've had an aspirational goal of this at one time, even happening by about now. But when they actually went into the logistics of pulling off the migration so that people who were stuck on the legacy could do things like have some hope of, moving legacy deployed apps, including stateful, over, they discovered that there were a number of moving parts they hadn't thought of, so that this has been delayed. And I'm not in charge of this. It's Walter Fender of Google, who's chair of SIG Cloud Provider. And even then, it's somewhat democratic. I think you've probably got a year and maybe longer. But you probably should pretend you've only got a year, because you don't want to be, doing this thing last minute. And if you're running it into any difficulties, if you at least attempt some migrations now and give feedback, there's some chance that your pain points would be addressed. But if you sit there and wait, until the code is actually getting removed out of the tree, I don't know, you might be faced with some ugly choices.
Yeah, the things we're looking at is just making, we can't move until we have everything at a supported vSphere version. And at our scale, that is a year, effort. So we should be, by the end of next year, up to a version that we could.
Yeah, I think you'll be good with the end of next year, but it would probably be prudent to try some test migrations without waiting to do that. Are you actually forced to do some big bang upgrade where everything happens at once?
No, but the places where we're really testing, I was just thinking, I'm like, we just can't mess up some of those. But yeah, that's probably a good idea. See if I can get another cluster in that environment.
Yeah, I don't know if I linked it in this deck. I whipped this deck together just an hour ago, but the sessions from KubeCon are now posted up on YouTube by the CNCF. And the actual wording of what the official story is on this migration, I would say listen to what Walter Fender said during the SIG Cloud Provider session. And I can track that down and post. I can send it to you and put it in the agenda notes, because I don't think I put it in the slide deck, but it would be useful. That's the official story, not listening to me. He made a statement at KubeCon, and I think that's, given that he's chair of SIG Cloud Provider, that's the one I'd go with. So what will happen is, individual clouds, the public clouds plus vSphere and a few others, get direction from SIG Cloud Provider. So we've already got, the out of tree ready, but the issue is that somebody will pull a switch and actually remove the code out of the main Kubernetes distro, and then it's no longer an option at that point. And that session was actually kind of an interesting one to listen to, because it went over kind of the details of actually the amount of code that's being removed is pretty big. And these are bits that if you're shuffling them out to, on-prem edge locations and stuff, you're paying for the bandwidth transmission and the storage. And, in a way, it's sad that Kubernetes as a container orchestrator was plugging the microservices versus monolith story. Well, in some ways, it was a monolith itself, so that you might be deploying on-prem on vSphere, but still dragging along the bits associated with cloud providers for Amazon, Google's cloud, Azure, whatever else might be in there. And it will be nice in some sense that goes away in the future. But I understand the pain if you got out there early and have to worry about the migration.
What are you guys seeing as the pain points people have been seeing in those migrations?
I
You've got
think
the
it
storage
is.
part that it kind of separates that out to its own component, right?
Yeah, I think it's this, you know, storage panes because the rest of your pods don't really have that much associated if you did move. And then ties to legacy software, like you just said, that you're on old vSphere releases. And for most people, I think most people who are on old vSphere releases also have they have a reason for being on the old ones, which is often that they're also on old hardware. And it's nice to say you could move up to 7.0, update 2 or update 3, the latest. But, you know, I do understand that there are some pieces of legacy hardware that simply can't be supported by the latest vSphere releases because there are some storage drivers and network drivers that dropped out of support. Some of them maybe can still run even unsupported, but some of them won't even install. So I think there are people in those kinds of positions. I know I was sort of in it, but I'm talking for me, it's running my home lab where, you know, given that it's a home lab, I'm cheap. I don't run out and buy new hardware every year. So I'm on older stuff, but even in production, there are places that end up with hardware. I think at this point, to be in that position, you'd probably be on hardware that's at least 5 years old, but there are people who are on hardware like that. And that could prevent you from upgrading to a newer vSphere, which could prevent you from upgrading to a newer Kubernetes. So anyway, so this new cloud provider, even though those slides presented at KubeCon said it was roadmap, it isn't anymore. It's been released now for a couple of weeks. You can download it there and get the docs at the link on this slide. There's also been a new CSI driver update that's come out, actually 2 of them in about the last month. So the 2.22 was bug fixes for people on the 2.2 series, and the 2.3 has some new features and some changes. I'm not going to go over them all here, but if you click that link on the docs for each of these, you can see the list of what's there. I think in the 2.3, it supported a new file system type, and I'm blanking on what the other one was, but there were a couple new features. Well, here, I guess I can open the doc and see what comes up. Oh, it supports XFS, and raw block volume support is now an alpha feature. So that's what came out in that 2.3.0 of CSI. Then at VMworld, the new 7.0 update 3 release of vSphere came out. A number of bug fixes, including some security fixes. There are some new devices supported. I think I glanced over the list, and I think a lot of the new devices that are being supported are in the realm of storage. But there are also deprecation warnings on some legacy devices. So that's been a recent trend that as every update comes out, some of the older storage, and I don't know if in this case any of the network NICs dropped off the map, but if you're on older hardware, you definitely should take a look at the release notes before blindly assuming that you can update. And I've posted a blog post there that kind of explains it in a little more detail in writing. That was by Bob Plankers. And I think he also has if you don't want to read the blog and prefer video, Bob Plankers also has a video form of that blog post up on YouTube. And once again, here's the release notes and the link to download that update to vSphere. Okay, so I do have a link to that session recording at KubeCon. So the second one shown here was by SIG Cloud Provider, and that has detail on what the expectation is for the calendar on when you're going to be forced to drop the in-tree cloud providers. And then Miles and I had a presentation on using GPUs with Kubernetes pods hosted on vSphere. So this is about using the Bitfusion technology where you can install NVIDIA GPUs in a portion of a vSphere cluster. It does not have to be on every node. And your Kubernetes workloads that would consume, it doesn't actually virtualize the hardware GPU. The approach that Bitfusion takes is to create a virtual CUDA API interface. So, and the bottom line is that you can deploy things like machine learning apps written to consume the CUDA API and be oblivious to whether the node, the Kubernetes cluster node it's running on, actually has a physical GPU present. It creates a network-based pipeline over to the node that has the physical GPU. And for many types of workloads, there is a cost because, you know, if you had a physical GPU, your data movement would happen over a PCI Express lane. And in this case, it's happening over an Ethernet link. You do want Ethernet that's 10 gigabits a second or better, preferably 40 from what I've heard, and 100 would be even better. But for the right kinds of workloads where they're long enough lived that the latency of filling that network pipe gets sort of covered up by the length of the job, I'm told that this can work quite well. The other type of workload that this can be very suitable for are things that could consume part of a GPU, but not be able to utilize the full server grade GPU. You know, there are a lot of scenarios where with machine learning, the training stage maybe uses full GPU cards, but subsequent execution might benefit from a portion of a card, but be unable to use the full card. And this Bitfusion technology lets you allocate resources in units of fractional GPUs or, you know, individual CUDA cores. And that can be nice for a runtime execution of machine learning workloads where you could have a bunch of Kubernetes pods sharing a GPU, each GPU card, each consuming a fractional part of it. And that would be something perhaps a little difficult to pull off in a pure physical scenario. So anyway, the link to that presentation recording is there. The decks for these are up on the KubeCon Sked site. I think those are now open to the public, but if anybody has trouble getting those decks, feel free to DM me on the user group Slack and I'll get you working links. But I think the one from the Kubernetes conference site should enable you to download those decks.
Which link are you talking about?
Well, I don't have the link in this slide, but it at every KubeCon conference, they have used some service called Sked, SCHED.com.
Oh, Sked, okay.
Yeah. And you can find the schedule. And then if you click on a session, the speakers are supposed to upload the decks. And for both of these sessions, I personally uploaded the decks myself, so I know they're there. Like I say, if you can't find those, just let me know. I'll get other links to the decks. And the VMworld sessions are all publicly available. You do have to create a free VMworld account to play them, but they're out there. And this link will search for VMworld from 2021 with an additional filter of Kubernetes. Now, I'll caution you that this group is about, you know, pure upstream open source Kubernetes. So some of those sessions were in the context of VMware's commercial distributions. but I think it's fair to say that in many cases, the things covered with regard to, what's available, best practices, et cetera, are more along the lines of use cases, so that you're likely to find useful content in those, even if nominally the session was sort of, VMworld isn't a KubeCon, so, it is a commercial conference. So if commercial pitches offend you, you probably shouldn't go look at these videos, but I still think that for many people, there's value to be found in these sessions, just because they're speakers giving talks, about Kubernetes in general, and the fact that they maybe used a commercial distribution is sort of orthogonal to the main message being delivered in this. And I believe that that filter will return you 20 or more sessions. So there's a fair amount of content out there available at that length.
There are also some see from the Code Connect, which are on YouTube and not on the VMworld site on VMware Code, which were more whatever. Some other stuff and some directly related to Kubernetes and not Tanzu specific as well.
Okay, great. I'll see if I can track down a filter to go find those then, and I'll update the agenda notes doc for today's meeting and put links to those.
I think there's a playlist. I'll try and find it and post it in the chat.
Okay, great. And if anybody caught any sessions either at KubeCon or at VMworld and wants to talk about things they'd recommend or discourage people from wasting their time on, go ahead and chime in here. Also, if you want to recount anything that occurred at these conferences, well, VMworld was pure virtual, so I don't know that this happens to a great extent, but KubeCon had a lot of interesting, call it the hallway track stuff going on that I found interesting. So if anybody wants to bring those sorts of things up, speak up now or ask questions about it. You're welcome to speak up now.
I thought VMworld was a lot better than last year, despite it still being a virtual conference. They really tried to give that kind of hallway feeling to it. They tried to keep their Slack channels active, and they had a lot of kind of additional stuff going on around the sessions. Mm-hmm. But I thought the most of the value was with the live kind of workshop-y sessions. So they had a lot of pre-recorded content. I mean, that stuff I don't see, that stuff I don't see has the added value. I mean, you can always watch it later, and it's free content. So that I got most of the value out of the Tech Plus Pass, because it was you do all the Meet the Expert sessions, and those were some of the best sessions, because you actually get to talk to people. If it's a smaller group, you actually get into quite a lot of detail.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think I did some of those myself, and they weren't being recorded. So for people who missed it, I'm not sure how much of an opportunity there is to catch up on what went on in those. But yeah, I had the same experience where I think people are learning to do these online conferences a little better, and even people are learning how to participate in them more effectively too. And Robert, were there any that were recorded that you recommend, or?
Well, I really only focused on the live sessions, and like you said, most weren't recorded. I think not to forget, like on the Monday you had the DevOps Loops kind of side conference, or the pre-VMworld conference, which was focused mostly on DevOps and cloud native stuff. That had some very excellent sessions in there as well. I believe all of those were recorded, but they were more the kind of the traditional sessions.
And they're all on YouTube. They're all on YouTube, and a lot of those were not VMware specific. Were upstream Kubernetes and development things around Spring and different things like that in microservices as well.
Yeah, so some of those are well worth rewatching also, because they're also slightly higher level. They were more like, what are the trends currently around modern apps development or the trends around DevOps? What's the kind of the current thinking out there? I thought those were, because I'm always into that high level story. I thought those were very valuable, some of those.
Okay, and for any of those interactive types that weren't recorded, perhaps if somebody wants to make a request, I could try to track down speakers to repeat the experience here in a future user group meeting, if it's of interest and yeah, kind of relevant to the subject of Kubernetes on vSphere. Okay, with that said, I think, okay, that's the end of what I had prepared here. So at this point, this was the recap on our agenda. If anybody's got any other subjects, the forum is open for discussion here. Also, I'll throw out anybody who's got requests for content at future meetings, include December or later. Let me know so that I can try to get something prepared and ready.
I don't.
Go for it.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you can go first.
I don't know, Steve, what falls within the guidelines of the user group here, but with TCE being open sourced and being a opportunity on vSphere, I don't know if that falls into a possible subject to bring up here, or if we try to be completely distribution agnostic in this group, even if it's not a commercial offering.
Yeah, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because we are supposed to be distribution agnostic, but just for the sake of explaining what it is we're talking about, at VMworld, VMware announced that they have released a free open source distribution of Kubernetes that's based on the same technology used in the Tanzu commercial products. So, like I said, it's same technology used in the Tanzu commercial. It does have some aspects that are a little different. Some of those Tanzu commercial products, obviously they come with commercial support and the community edition does not. But the Tanzu Community Edition is also going to be used as a leading platform for evaluating alpha level features and technology ahead of what gets into the commercial product. It's also expected to be a platform that would be the first to release support for the Kubernetes 0.0 releases. A lot of people in production stay away from a Kubernetes 0.0 release, yet there are use cases like your development teams needing to get early warnings if there's compatibility issues with a new Kubernetes drop, where they might need a distribution that gets out there with earlier access. And that's kind of the flavor of what this Tanzu Community Edition is. And like I say, it is 100% open source, 100% free, meaning no registration, no time limits. And it exists, but in fairness, under the charter of this user group, I don't think it should be treated any differently than community offerings from Rancher or Red Hat. So I'm not willing to devote a whole meeting to it, but I'll explain that it is out there and it was announced recently. If you want to learn more on the Kubernetes Slack, there is a Slack channel created for it. And you can go, they have their own community meetings and their own GitHub repo. So you can learn more about it there. Let's see, I think the Slack channel is, I think it's Tanzu-Community-Edition, right?
Yeah. I think one other subject, Steve, that would be awesome to have, because it's relevant to vSphere much more than other environments with Kubernetes, is to have a session possibly around Kubernetes and AirGaped environments.
Yeah.
I know that's only to specific use cases, but to have a session on the challenges and the solutions around air gapping with Kubernetes could be interesting. I don't
Okay,
know. I've seen that
I would
before.
like to do that actually. I think, and it really aligns well with this group because people running Kubernetes on vSphere often are, yeah, well, they're almost always in an on-prem scenario. And technically, you could run vSphere in Amazon's cloud, but I think most of the people coming to this group are more of interest in running it on-prem. And sometimes the AirGap is voluntary when you're on-prem. Sometimes it's a temporary outage where you're faced with, a short-term AirGap, whether you like it or not. And the kind of things you do for AirGap can often be relevant to people who don't prefer to run AirGap, but face the issue from time to time. So yeah, that's a great idea. I'll try to line something up along those lines.
Yeah,
and I think people from like Carvel could be interesting there and whatnot, and things like that, may be interesting in terms of packaging and, kind of bringing stuff into environments and things like that. Again, just as opportunities.
Yeah.
As part of the larger picture.
Yeah, what you just said triggered me as well, Scott, because the what I found interesting about the VMware distributions and NNTC is this adoption of this packaging standard around the Carvel toolkit. I mean, still being relatively new to this world, I'm curious and interested in the differences between things like Kustomize and Helm and these Carvel tools, and maybe there are other methodologies out there that I'm not even aware of around how people are trying to deliver deployments into Kubernetes or trying to manage that process. And the AirGap part of it is like, well, it's a major driver behind the Carvel stuff. At least it's becoming one, as we can kind of notice in some of these projects. So that I'd love someone with a little bit more broader knowledge about the differences between those different ways of delivering software into Kubernetes to maybe contrast those different approaches. So that's something I'd like to know more about. But another idea I had, it's actually something that I would like to do a session about at some point, because kind of a hobby horse for me is availability around Kubernetes. So we've talked about this at this user group before, but how do you map availability constructs, that are native to the Kubernetes world and the cloud native world onto cloud provider logic, in our case vSphere, and how do you make those two things work together really well, and that can be mostly distribution agnostic. Obviously my experience is going to be on the VMware TKG side, but these principles, they apply generally. I've never actually seen anyone do a session on that or write a decent blog post about that.
Yeah, there actually were sessions on that at KubeCons going back 3 to 4 years, and then it sort of dropped off the map. And so much has changed since then that I think it's perfectly valid to go revisit that. What hasn't changed since 3 to 4 years in Kubernetes?
Yeah, and it's not just, I mean, like you could just do one just about storage, right?
Right.
There's so many aspects to it.
Yeah, when you get to availability, there's, how do you make it resilient so that you never took an outage in the first place? Then taking it to the next stage where, let's assume you took an outage in spite of your best efforts. How do you get back to where you were? Or how do you fail over to an alternate region? It's a pretty rich topic that I think would go beyond a single meeting potentially.
And especially with the, CPI, CSI migration from cloud providers, where all of that changes on vSphere, the way that it's done from the entry model. Even people that are using that today, there are different capabilities that exist today within the VMware solutions for Kubernetes or VMware integrations with Kubernetes. That makes it relevant.
I mean, even one of the things I was going to bring up was something that I don't even know if it works the same in the outer tree, but like an issue we have right now is if we're using the entry cloud provider, if when the kubelet starts up on one of the control plane nodes, if it can't talk to the vSphere API, then it hangs. It never starts up. So there's things like that.
Yeah, just a quick answer on that. In the end, the node will come up, but it will be not available. It'll be not ready because the CPI won't. The CPI still needs that connection to vCenter in order to configure itself and to get back the provider ID. So that still exists. There is work upstream to change that into in cluster API upstream, meaning not a VMware solution, but a subset of distributions. And in cluster API, there is a work to move to what's called a paravirtual model, where in the management cluster API cluster, you would have access to the vCenter and didn't need that from your workload clusters or your actual application clusters. But that's still work going on upstream and is only for a subset of Kubernetes distributions that are based off of cluster API.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is right now, and I feel like they may have fixed this in a newer Kubernetes version, but in the current version we're running, if it stays that way long enough, the kubelet just it stops trying to start the controller manager, stops trying to start some of those control plane pods, and never tries it. Even it just times out. It just like, I give up. So
yeah,
I think there's
an exponential back off there.
Yeah,
in the kubelet code. And you have to restart kubelet in order for it to try again.
Yes.
Yes, exponential backoffs are always fun.
So that kind of goes back to maybe some of that air gapping that you were even talking about. Is essentially we have some of our clusters air gapped from the vCenter, and so they're not always air gapped, but if they're remote and they can be, then air gapped and they're expected to work. But if one of those nodes restarts during that situation, then it's stuck like that. So, and that's the time you don't want it to be stuck like that. That's the time you can't actually access it, but you want it to keep working.
Well, I'd like to work on a presentation like this of, the availability interactions. And it strikes me that this is a pretty big topic in that there are availability concerns viewed at the Kubernetes cluster level, just get the cluster to tolerate incidents. And then if you go a step further and run app workloads on top of that, there are tools, like Valero level things for achieving resilience up at an app level. And I think they're two different subjects with different techniques for addressing the issue, but they're both very relevant. Maybe trying to commingle them in one talk is a little too much and potentially confusing. Anybody got thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think it definitely should be split into, different talks. I think there's the infrastructure side and how you deal with infrastructure level of Kubernetes and AirGaped. And then there's also the more, I guess, developer, DevOps, whatever, the applications in AirGaped and actually utilizing Kubernetes and AirGaped once you have a Kubernetes cluster. I think are two separate domains that both deserve, an entire session possibly, just because they're so large and, there's so much to talk about there.
Earlier on in this discussion, I know a few of you brought up the whole packaging thing with Carvel, but I just want to make sure that everybody on this call even knows what Carvel even is, because it's relatively newer. If you do, just say so now and stop me. But Carvel is an attempt to elevate packaging of apps and system tools beyond what's available in Helm. It allows you to publish things in a system that offers opportunities for being a little more opinionated to keep you on a safe glide path. And it is being used in Tanzu, but it is an open source project that is supported by the in the CNCF infrastructure. And I think a few of those things, Scott, I wanted to give you a shout out for some of those packages you created, when Tanzu Community Edition came out, because the KubeVip in particular, I went out there and deployed in my home lab, and that package works great. And I wanted to thank you for it.
Definitely. Thank you. And I actually I'm about to push it, the AirGap version of that, which contains the containers and everything so that it can be fully air-gapped as well. But yeah, I've also built the entire Bitnami Helm chart repository into an air-gapped solution using this.
Okay, that's my next homework assignment.
I think, what is it? I think it's like 57 gigabytes for the last 4 versions of every Helm chart there, but completely open source and works on any. I've used it on EKS Anywhere. I've used it on Tanzu Community Edition. I've used it on commercial offerings from VMware, and I've used it on a kind cluster as well. So it's, I would say, agnostic. The only thing I don't know if it works on is OpenShift, because that's its own beast. But yeah, so I definitely think that Carvel would be an interesting conversation to have here, because image package especially will be huge for AirGaped.
Yeah, do you, Scott and Steve, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. I mean, I don't understand the Carvel toolkit as deeply as certainly as Scott. But it seems to address some limitations around Helm mostly, and then I was kind of already familiar with some of the overlay stuff that YTT does because of Customize. I'm just wondering if these are things that the wider community outside of the VMware ecosystem, if people, are looking for alternatives to that, how broad is the problem? How wide is the problem? And how much of a chance does a project like the Carvel tools have of breaking out of the vSphere ecosystem when it comes to packaging stuff for Kubernetes?
Yeah, I think the problem has to be there. Otherwise, you wouldn't see these alternate packaging mechanisms being developed. And even Helm went through a generational shift, right? When it went from V2 to V3. So people learn things.
But just that point, Steve, because it's interesting you say that. The problem that I have I'm very much inside the vSphere ecosystem, right? So all I kind of know, well, I know a bit more now, but a lot of this initial stuff is coming to me through the lens of what VMware is developing in need of Tanzu. So I don't know what else is going on, and so I'm very much aware, and I see this in a bunch of different projects. All the open source projects that VMware is involving themselves in is very much to serve the needs of Tanzu, but broadly in all kinds of different ways. So I'm not automatically assuming that they're pushing a particular project or a particular technology stack because it would benefit the community generally or Kubernetes generally, because I know that there's a big commercial interest in what's driving them in a lot of these projects. So that's why I would like to someone with a broader experience of the kind of community view of this to explain, to kind of contrast those things, because I've seen a few examples where VMware seems to be doing something very interesting and innovative. No one's heard of it outside of the vSphere or Pivotal ecosystem.
Yeah, it's kind of, oh, go ahead.
I can tell you from my experiences when I deal with a lot of public cloud Kubernetes as well, from the hyperscalers and their managed Kubernetes as well as Ranch or OpenShift and other distributions. And it's definitely an issue that exists in other places. There is, the partial issue of, you know, in the end, who came first to the game. So Helm came first. So that's what most people are using. Customize is built into kubectl. So a lot of people are using that because they can just do a kubectl apply -k. But the issues with both of them are prevalent, and you see that by customers and users in environments that are not just Tanzu. You see that in any Kubernetes environment. And as such, the Carvel toolset, I think, definitely has a lot to offer in those worlds. And we're actually utilizing it in non-Tanzu clusters today. So it definitely is getting usage there. Is it as big as I think it should be? The answer is no. But it's getting there. More and more people are using it these days outside of Tanzu, and it's just very new, which is why I don't think is as prevalent in the community as it will be, I think, in the not so far future.
Yeah,
I think there's an opportunity to gain traction, but this is tough. You know, often these major problems attract. The fact that a lot of people feel a pain point often causes 2 or 3 solutions to the pain point to come about. And then you have to go through something. I mean, this goes all the way back to the early days of Kubernetes, when you had the orchestrator wars of Kubernetes versus Mesos versus, I don't know, Swarm and a few others that were in the mix. I think it's inevitable. And in some ways, it's good to have these competing things at an early stage to get the best ideas out there, because I think people see the alternatives and maybe plagiarize a bit if everything is open source, and you kind of can end up with something that picks up the best aspects of them all. And I think some of these projects don't necessarily spend their money trying to fund, they'd rather fund development efforts than fund evangelism to get, you know, knowledge of their existence out there and things. And maybe that's a good thing too, that, yeah, I've seen projects where all the budget goes into the evangelism and the project itself is, in the long run, isn't that good. So it's a balancing act.
One of the things that impressed me about the TC release was that there seems to have been a very big effort to actually put all of the community building blocks in place from day one, right? So they have, you know, like dedicated community manager, and they have dedicated evangelist people, you know, in that role promoting that project. You know, they're putting it big on the radar, trying to attract a lot of people, which in turn is going to help Carvel a lot, right?
Yeah.
And a bunch of other stuff around TC.
Yeah, now Carvel has its own community meetings and community management and Slack channel too, but
it was just before this.
Yeah.
It was a half hour ago.
But I think that at least from the VMware perspective, we've learned that if you don't do that, you're doomed. I mean, you know, you could have the best project out there, but if people can't find support and get their questions answered and have a feeling that they can get listened to with regard to issues and feature requests, it's going nowhere in the long run. And I think if it's a project that has a lot of VMware contribution, that's currently viewed as a necessity on anything that we're going to get involved in. But it's nice to hear your feedback that's the perception, that you see that taking off in the right direction, at least. Okay, well, I've got some great ideas then for future meetings of this group. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to put together that whole availability thing as quickly as first week of December, but I can try. And Robert, if you want to follow up, I know you mentioned that you might be interested in presenting. So you're welcome to that, either solo or if you want, I'll volunteer. I find that when I work on these presentations, even doing a deck, it forces me to learn a lot myself. So if you don't want to do that solo, let me know too, and I can either recruit other participants or try to help out myself, with, as long as you have the understanding I'm not claiming to be the subject matter expert there. Although I do have a fair amount of experience with regard to backup in particular.
Yeah, no, it's just an idea I have. I mean, I'm actually there's a VMware User Group, the Dutch VMware User Group meeting is coming up in December, and they've asked me to do something for it. I'm still trying to figure out what, whether I'll just rehash my Tanzu for Dummies and update it, or do something on TCE or something. But that idea of doing a proper one about availability, I've been thinking about that a long time, but it will also require quite a lot of preparation, I think.
Yeah. And by the way, the CFPs are open for KubeCon Europe right now. So if you wanted, rather than to do it under this group, do it as a KubeCon CFP.
Yeah,
that might be an idea. And I might be.
What I usually do is I create a general story and then I just submit it everywhere. I'll just do the same thing everywhere, or slight variations of it. Because once I have a shtick, I like to bandy it around, you know.
Right. Yeah, you put the same amount of effort in. I do the same thing where if you're going to do a presentation, maybe you can get a blog post out of the same amount of effort. And also, if you're going to one of the major conferences like KubeCon, I've always found it useful to practice a presentation at a meetup or something first, where you don't have as many eyeballs and yet actually probably can get more interactive feedback at something like a meetup.
Yeah, but I don't expect to put anything like that together this year. I don't see myself having the time for it. But if you want to give a shot at that topic, I'd love to see.
Yeah. Like I say, if you're interested in maybe even if it's next year doing that joint either with me or I can help recruit others to participate in it. That might actually be a decent panel session for a conference as well. Maybe we can put something together.
Definitely. And I'm more than happy, Steve, to also help out with a session on, if we end up doing one on Carvel and things like that, and, AirGaped installations and things like that, more than happy to help out with a session in that world as well.
Okay, that sounds great. In fact, like I said, I really appreciated some of those packages you put together, and they're of general interest, like your KubeVip. So there's the topic of general Carvel as well as some of the actual working examples of how you can utilize it to do some good in the world. I would love to have you do a session like that.
Yeah, definitely. More than happy to do that and, discuss how to do that. I just built one for generic Helm instead of just Bitnami. Things like that, are in the end helpful for development cycles outside of, specific, VMware open source, things as well.
Okay, that sounds great. I'll follow up with both of you then on DMing you on the Kubernetes Slack, if that's a good way to keep in touch with you.
Definitely.
Okay, we're nearing the top of the hour. So last call, if anybody's got any additional items they want to talk about or propose, otherwise I'll call this meeting to a close. Okay, I'll take silence as no, and thanks for attending. It was, I ended up learning a lot from the audience as I usually do. So thanks for attending. Bye.
Bye.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Steve.